Okay, so I brought the set extension into Shake, and I placed it in an over event, or over node, over top of the Lake Towers plate. So that basically just layers it over top of the plate, just like we had it in Photoshop. I'm going to duplicate the plate and use the mat to cut out the water. I can use a fade event set down to 0, feeding the mat into the alpha channel, and that'll just cut out the plate water that we want there. Now the next step is we need to make sure that we offset the plate. We'll leave the mat where it is, but we'll go ahead and put a offset on the plate so that the water ends up in the right place. So if we go to transform and pan, we can go in and type negative 526, which is the number that we figured out in Photoshop. So now if we compare the offset to our reference frame, they lined up. So I'm just going to layer the water over top of the plate instead of the set extension. Put the set extension on top of everything. Now if we render things out from the over 2 node, the bottom left node called over, we'll notice that the water that we're adding is a little bit on the bright side. It's not being layered over top of things the way we had it in Photoshop. So what we have to do is go into the element and turn auto alpha on. Do the same thing here, and now you can see the reflection appears just as dark as it did in the initial plate. So I'm just going to rename a few of these layers, and I'm going to slip the sink on this one plate layer. What that means is basically I'm just going to take that little bit of water and I'm going to offset the movie in time just for that one patch of water. And that way the two reflections, the golden reflections, won't be identical. Since our set extension shot is 100 frames and our plate was 489, we have plenty of frames to play around with there. Plenty of frames that the audience will never actually see. I'm going to render a bunch of frames so that we can see the water reflections moving with regard to the set extension. So we're only really playing every 5 or 10 frames here, but you get the idea. Now the next step is to utilize the tower mat. So I'm going to apply a adjust HSV to the plate and connect the red feed the yellow mat into it and tweak the hue offset to warm it up so that again it looks like the other building in the plate. And finally we'll go in and do the third copy, which is the yellow water mat. And of course this water mat is going to affect the color of the blue reflection in the water. Okay, so we're going to get the water reflection a little more golden, try and match it a little closer, and we'll render it with everything. Take a look at it from the over 2 node, which is the last node in the entire comp right now. Now if you look closely, we have a little flaw here in our reflection. It's the pink spot that trails some pink reflections. So I'm going to go in and create a roto mask, or a roto shape, and trace the general area where we see pink. Now if I put a fade node on a copy of that water slip sink, I can feed my roto shape in, and I can now slice a piece of the water, and now and move it around until that section that turned pink moves off outside of the mat. So you can move it as far as you want, just trying to find a piece of the water that looks acceptable within your new mat. So really we're just taking a little sliver and copying it from the plate, sliding it over here to cover up the objectionable pink reflection. Try use something that once we hit the hue saturation changes, that it's going to look realistic and not pop out like that pink reflection did. I'm going to soften it a little bit, soften that mat a little bit. Softening the mat or the roto shape simply softens the amount that it's cut out. It doesn't soften or blur the actual image itself. And of course, if we slip the sync on that copy, we won't have a perfect copy of what's going on with regard to ripples in time. Now if we look at the painting, we have a couple light sources there, floating in black. And what I want to do is I just want to make sure that one of the reflections that I'm creating is in fact lining up with the lights that are in the set extension. So that one seems to line up quite well. I'm just toggling between two renders using the 1 key on the keyboard that allows you to put a render in each of the buffers A and B, just in case you're new to Shake. It's a really valuable tool. I'm just going to get back into Photoshop and get in there and darken down the far ends of the bridges. Right now I'm darkening down the top bridge. And the reason why I want to do this is because when I took another look at how I painted the lighting on the far ends of the bridges, it didn't seem to make much seems to be a little more illuminated. Now let's turn our attention to the left side of the frame, to that flat rooftop. Where that building meets the sky, it seems like it's just a little bit too plain. And since we have all of this nice Asian architecture with nice bowed rooftops, I'm going to go in there, I'm just going to paint mimicking that type of architectural style. Since it's back there in the dark, I'm just going to kind of paint it in loosely using some of those values that we see in the back, and see if we can get the hint, get the suggestion that there's some type of more traditional forms back there. And I'll try and paint just a little spire on top, something again that just kind of mimics the foreground elements. And then maybe just copy it down a few layers. We can play with the proportion and scale of them. Just try and get something that makes it seem a little more traditional back there, and not so much like a modern type of apartment complex. It's also good to remember to kind of pink lighting that that building has. There's a few buildings in the background that have similar lighting. So if we keep this this additional architecture somewhat dark, but add just a little bit of a pink front to it, it'll look like it's sitting back there, catching some of the similar light. It's just a little bit farther than the light source, farther from the light source than the other building is. So it's not quite as bright. Okay, so let's turn our attention to the left side of the painting again. And those three towers, they don't quite sit in there just yet. They need more detail. A whole lot of what's going on back in there. So if we create our set extension with that same idea in mind in that particular area, it should look quite real. I'm just using a lighter value that I dropped from the plate, and we're going to simulate some vertical walls. Maybe brighten them up a little bit from a zoomed out view. Lets me get the big picture of how much impact how much I'm impacting the painting when I do that. So I sampled the pink color from the right side of the frame. I'm just going to use that over here to paint that in. I chose that color over on the right just because it is pretty subtle. But when you look close enough, you can tell that it's actually a light source, or light being cast on the building from a nearby light source. So let's zoom in and start adding a few windows to that wall back in there. On a separate layer, I'm going to paint these little windows with a color that I dropped from the rooftop above. And since it's on its own layer, I can just chop off any overpaint that makes the windows look crooked or uneven. Plus I can go and copy them around, slide them into place, and I don't have to paint dozens of windows back in there. Okay, so I'm just going to clean up some of my layers here, merge them together, and then I'm going to start looking at cropping this image. In the comp, we can put a 185 crop on this shot, and so I'm going to set the 185 limitation in my marquee tool, find a nice position, and on a new layer, fill that with black. So the composition looks pretty good right now. We can always tweak it later on in the comp as well. In the comp, I plan to put a slight bit of a push into this shot, just because in today's film industry, we very rarely will see a camera that's locked off, a camera that is not moving in modern films. So it's always nice to put a little bit of movement into your shots, even if the plate, like this one for instance, doesn't have any camera movement. So as you can tell, I'm just adding duplicates of these buildings back in there. I decided that the big pink wall that was illuminated was still a little bit too distracting, so if we try and cover up a lot of it with these added painted buildings, then Now if we go and add a crop node, this will actually allow us to crop the image so that we don't look at the black at all. And we just discard every bit of all the pixels outside of this box. So I'm just trying to make sure that we have the crop nice and tight around the black edges of that crop so that we have the exact same crop that I wanted from Photoshop. And now, sitting back again, looking at the composition, I wonder if maybe the entire shot might look a little bit better if we flopped it horizontally. So I'm just going to add a flop node that does that. It flops it horizontally. And I think that actually kind of sits better with me. I kind of like the more dominant figures on the left. It's just kind of a gut feeling, and some people even say that because as Westerners we read books from left to right, that perhaps we favor compositions that are more dominant on the left or have a read that is similar from left to right. Now the next step is to put a scale in here, and what the scale is going to do is the scale node is going to mimic the look of a camera pushing in. As you can see here, a scale of 1.1 or 1.05 enlarges the image just a little bit so that it kind of feels like our camera is zooming in. So since I like 1.05 for a scale factor, I'll set that value for frame 100, and then at frame 1 we'll keep our scale set to the value of 1. So as we play the entire animation, the entire movie from frame 1 to 100, the entire shot will actually scale up. Now because we're actually scaling the image up, what we're implying is that the camera is zooming in on the image. The main difference between a camera zoom and a dollying camera, or a camera that's pushing in, moving inwards, is that the zooming camera is a camera that's stationary, and simply we're using a lens that is zooming inward, showing us the image that's larger and giving us the appearance that we're getting closer. However, a camera that's actually moving closer or dollying in forward would show us parallax, and that is, it would show us a little bit of, it would reveal a little bit of information of the buildings or terrain that is behind other foreground elements such as the tree branches here. So here we are back in Photoshop, and you know, after all, it does seem like I want to try and resolve this little area a little bit better. Sometimes you get a part of your set extension or your painting that you just, you know, end up noodling for quite a while just because it's tending to fight you along the process. So I guess that's what this little pink area is doing to me. So I'm going to go in and try and copy some of that architecture back in there, darken it down so that it's really not noticeable. Another thing to consider is that when you make decisions, as I did earlier, as far as leaving an area that is illuminated, and then you go on to make further decisions like cropping the image, just like I did, take the 185 crop, then you might have to go back and revisit those decisions that you've made, just because you don't want to end up with bright areas or what have you at the edges of your new composition. So in the spirit of leaving a little bit of illumination back in there on the architecture, I'm going to go and paint a little bit of detail and try and get it to look not quite so flat. So with these final paint touch-ups, I think we're nearing a point where we're going to send these changes over to Shake once again, and we're almost at that point in time where we're going to get ready to render our final composite of this set extension. Okay, so here's the final composite of our set extension. As you can see, we have moving water, and all of our towers are in the same color space. So I hope you've enjoyed these lectures, and we'll get on to the next one.